Okay, Tim is there. Jeff's there. Good morning.
Hi, guys.
Impressive, 9:30 in the morning. The whole class is turned up. Welcome to the Wilson Center. I'm Jane Harmon, recovering politician. It's not a 12-step program. But I've offered some respite to two dear friends who've come a mile off the hill to talk together and to you and to me about a critical subject. In the 24/7 coverage of Donald Trump Jr. and Russia, a major development, more than one, but a major development has been underreported. With the Iraqis in the lead, ISIS no longer controls Mosul. There have been tiny little articles in the paper and on the airwaves about this. Why do I mention this? Because authorization for the U.S. mission that was part of the coalition that achieved this victory was under the threadbare authorization for the use of military force of 2001, the 2001 AUMF in shorthand, which Jeff Flake and I voted for when we were members of the House. I don't think Tim Kaine was yet a senator, and we voted for it, and everybody voted for it except for one member of the House, Barbara Lee, back in the day. And I'm speaking for me, but I bet he agrees with me. When I voted for that, this was to authorize our country to go against those who hurt us on 9/11, based in Afghanistan. And when I voted for that, I never imagined that it would still be in force 16 years later and apply to whatever military activities we undertake in the greater Middle East. So in 2013, that was even 4 years ago, here at the Wilson Center, Bob Corker, now chairman of Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was on a program talking about the need for a new AUMF. And he said that Congress needed to take ownership and that the language authorizing our military activities around the world needed review and refinement because, and this is Corker, very few Americans have any stake or ownership in our foreign policy. And, he continued, I think that is a major problem for our nation, and he called Congress's failure to act irresponsible. I know those words would not surprise my two friends on either side. Shortly afterwards, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which they both are members of, marked up and passed an AUMF against ISIS, but it went nowhere. My good friends who are here today have proposed a new draft. They proposed a draft AUMF in 2015. I should have mentioned that. And they have now introduced an improved, better product in 2017. And their improved, better product explicitly authorizes military action against 3 terror groups, gives Congress an oversight role over who can be considered associated. That's one of the issues with the 2001 AUMF with each group, and in which countries military action can take place. And their bill provides an expedited process for Congress to reauthorize. In other words, their bill sunsets, I guess, in 5 years, but Congress can reauthorize it. So gives Congress another chance in case it thinks that the bill needs revision or needs to expire. And finally, their bill does repeal the 2001 and the 2002 AUMFs that are still in place. This issue is a personal passion of mine. I think, as a former 9-term member of the House, that Congress has a constitutional responsibility to oversee and set the framework for our military action abroad. And I think that Congress has abdicated that responsibility. And as I mentioned, no one thought that what we voted on 16 years ago would still be in effect. So a couple of weeks ago, Representative Barbara Lee, who still serves in the House, offered an amendment to the House Defense Appropriations Bill. And that bill was unanimously reported with her amendment to sunset the 2001 AUMF in 8 months. Whether her amendment will survive is an issue. But surely the sentiment behind her amendment, I think, is one that I would salute and one that's part of this new bill. Neither of today's guests is a stranger to the Wilson Center. Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona was here fairly recently to keynote our Mexico Institute's third annual Building a Competitive U.S.-Mexico Border. It was a conference last year. Senator Tim Kaine has been here several times, both for briefings and to participate in activities. And as you know, he was a vice presidential candidate in 2016. Both, as I mentioned, are members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And what we're going to do is each of them will make some brief comments about this topic. I will then ask them questions, and you will then ask them questions. And I'm warning them right now, the smartest audiences turn up for Wilson Center programs. So get ready. Senator Jeff Flake.
Well, thank you. Let me just say what a privilege it is to be here. I really enjoyed the Mexico and the Border Forum last year, and I appreciate the great work that the Wilson Center does on a number of issues, and trade in particular, and with Mexico and national security issues. As you mentioned, Jane, we did vote on the 2001 AUMF. I think a lot of people will be surprised to learn that of those in the House today, more than 300 were not there in 2001. 300 out of 435 have never voted on a war authorization, and yet we continue to have war activities. And that's simply not right. In the Senate, 2001, of those who are still here, 77 have never voted on a war authorization. More than 300 in the House, 77 in the Senate have never voiced their opinion on whether or not we should be in conflict. Senator Kaine and I attended a meeting, I'm trying to remember the date, but several years ago with the Obama White House, where we sat down in the Roosevelt Room with White House legal counsel and chief of staff and other members to talk about an AUMF. I just remember leaving that meeting and Senator Kaine and I saying to each other, this is why we came to the Senate. It's discussions like this, where a bipartisan group of people sit down together and say, what is the way forward? How do we make sure that we are on legal footing in terms of declaring war or moving forward with authorization for use of military force? And how is that done, and how can we do it on a bipartisan basis? I think we all recognize that we in Congress, the administration, any administration, Republican or Democrat, will take any power you can give them. And we shouldn't willingly cede that kind of power, as we have done in the Congress over the past several years. And more importantly, we've got to have skin in the game. It's too easy for members of Congress to simply blame the administration, Republican or Democrat, when they don't agree with what's being done with regard to foreign wars or conflicts. Our allies certainly need to know where we stand. Our adversaries need to know where we stand. I know Senator Kaine has a son in the military. I have a brother in Afghanistan as we speak. They need to know that we're behind them. They need to know that we speak with one voice. I think the only thing worse than not having a new AUMF or a relevant AUMF is to have a completely partisan product and to pass something out of the House and the Senate with just one party. I think that would be devastating. We've got to make sure that this is a product that we can support on both sides of the aisle. And that's why it's been such a pleasure and a privilege to work with Senator Kaine in this regard. And I appreciate the work that he and his staff have done, and working with our staff as well. So, and Senator Kaine, I'm sure will explain more about the legislation itself. But I think that this is a better bill than we introduced before. And we've had one hearing already in Foreign Relations. We're having more. And the action that was taken by the House the other day, if nothing else, signals that they're uncomfortable with the current situation as well, and that works to our favor. I'm glad that the Wilson Center has taken this up. I hope that it's contagious and that other groups will be insisting on it as well. But thanks again for having me here.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thanks to Jane. It's great to be back. I really rely on the Wilson Center. I'm on the Armed Services and Foreign Relations committees, and anytime I travel, in connection with those committees. I always get the official briefing from state or DOD, but I always try to get a Wilson Center briefing as well, because the expertise here is superb. And it's not just the administration's line. The administration's line is very important, no matter who the administration is, but it's important to go beyond it. And I've really appreciated the Wilson Center, and Jane, your leadership has been particularly important. And I also just have to say, it's a treat to work with Jeff Flake. This is a really important issue. And it's one that I also am kind of obsessed about. Jane mentioned it. First, I'm a Virginian, and so forgive me for being Virginia-centric, but people like Madison, who drafted the Constitution, gathering the great ideas, they really had a very radical idea, Madison did. The notion that war would be declared by a legislative body, that's not the way it was pretty much anywhere in 1787, and it's still really not that way. They tried to change human history. They viewed war as being, at that point in time, it was for the king, the emperor, the monarch, the sultan, and they said, we don't want that. We want war, the initiation of war, to be done by the people's elected legislative body. And then once initiated, you have to have a commander-in-chief who can carry it out with military leadership. Why did they do that? They recognized, go read Henry V. I mean, they recognized executives overreach and start wars for all kinds of nutty reasons. And they wanted to have the beginning of a war authorized by the people's elected legislative body. And then when you're putting people into harm's way and they're risking their lives, there is a consensus behind them, because there's been a debate of the people's elected legislative body and a thumbprint on, yeah, this is in the national interest. I think they were right to say that there should be that consensus before we order people to risk their lives in harm's way. And second, as Jeff mentioned, Virginia, like every state, we're very connected to the military, but maybe more so in terms of just the sheer numbers of veterans, active duty, Guard Reserve, DOD civilians, DOD contractors, military families in Virginia. All of us have a direct connection. Jeff has a connection through his brother. I have a connection through a son in the Marines, and that makes this very personal. We've introduced a bill, and I do think it's better, and I'll tell you how we've learned along the way, because some of the problem of not voting on a new authorization is frankly lack of backbone in Congress. I mean, that's a big chunk of the problem. That if you can get away with not casting a war vote, which by definition should be the hardest vote you'll cast, it should be harder than any other vote. If you can get away with not casting and kind of blame the president, if it works out well, Mr. President, we were behind you all the time. If it works out badly, how dare you do this? If you can not have your fingerprints on it, you might want to avoid that. We're pretty good at avoiding tough issues in Congress sometimes, and that's one of the challenges of the body. But it's not just that. There's also some complexities to this that I think I have had a better understanding of. I've now been part of 3 AUMFs. So when President Obama decided we needed to go on offense against ISIS in late August of 2014, he spoke to the American public September 10, 2014, we have to go on offense against ISIS. I introduced an authorization within a week. I just basically took his speech and wrote an authorization based on his description of the mission. I introduced it myself, which meant that it was not intentionally partisan, but it was not bipartisan. I introduced it myself. We had a hearing in the Foreign Relations Committee, and in December we marked it up and voted on it. The vote was partisan. It went to the floor at the end of a Congress right before a changeover, but it didn't go anywhere, partly because of timing, but partly because this shouldn't be partisan. Certainly support for our troops isn't partisan. Certainly opposition to ISIS isn't partisan, but the authorization at that point was. Jeff and I talked after the year turned over into 2015, and in June of 2015, we introduced a bipartisan authorization. Okay, so there's an improvement. But I would say if I look back on it, here was a weakness. We were trying to authorize this action against ISIS, and we were trying to square some differences. Democrats don't like ground troops, so what limitation could we put in about ground troops? Republicans had their issues. What could we do there? How could we square some of these differences? And we were looking at it in a pretty narrow way, which is, how do we authorize this action against ISIS? That didn't even get a committee hearing or a committee vote, much less floor action. But we worked on it together and developed a good relationship between our teams. Now we're in a new administration, and that's a good time to revisit when there's a new revisit the authorities. And so our team started working together, and I think what we realized is one of the reasons this is hard is not just the backbone problem, that's a problem. But another reason it's hard, and I just came from speaking to all the Marine 3 and 4 stars this morning, they're gathered for an offsite at the Navy Yard about this, is when we think about war, we usually think about states. almost all of our doctrines and thinking about war are wars involving states. Geneva Conventions that states sign up for, the treatment of prisoners, things like that. And when you think about a war against states, you don't have to define the geography. The geography tends to be sort of self-obvious. So a lot of what we think about when we think about war, we think about states, but we're in a different kind of world right now. The reality of non-state actors using violence to achieve their end is not just a temporary phenomenon anymore. I think we kind of have to grapple with the fact that it's going to be with us for a while, whether it's Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban, or the Sinaloa cartel, or Boko Haram, or the Lord's Resistance Army, non-state actors, some connected or supported by states, Hezbollah is an example, but non-state actors have a huge throw weight in the world of the 21st century, but a lot of our doctrines don't really take that into account. So in the version that we've drafted now, we've kind of tried to make it a little more of a template, not just authorizing action against ISIS, but thinking about what it is to authorize action against non-state actors as fundamentally a little bit different from state actors. So compared to our earlier versions, we do three things in this that I think are important. One, we have a very specific definition of who it is we're fighting against. The 9/11 authorization that these guys voted for said the perpetrators of the attack of 9/11. That was kind of who it was, but it didn't name the groups or even any individuals. We name in our authorization ISIS, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. And then we have a fairly specific provision for adding in associated forces by a presidential listing that could be subject to a disapproval by Congress if we don't think, no, that group really isn't associated with the three. And so there's a listing and delisting that's a little bit like the State Department, what the State Department uses for listing terrorist organizations. Who are we fighting against? Let's be really clear about it. Where are we fighting? The 9/11 authorization has no geography reference to it, and it's been used in 14 different countries since 2001 to carry out some kinetic or other activity. So we, in our version, use a definition of the geography, the 7 countries where military action is currently underway against those 3 organizations. But again, we have a listing and delisting process. If the president decides, wow, ISIL really is now mutating in a country and posing a threat to the U.S. that we didn't have on the initial 6, the president can list and expand the geography subject to a resolution of disapproval in Congress if we don't think that's appropriate. And the third thing is duration. We run into the problem of these kind of zombie authorizations that when you put them in place, they don't have a duration. They just live forever, and they get used to justify actions wherever. I mentioned the 2001 authorization has been used in 14 different countries. It's been used on 37 different occasions in 14 countries since 2001. So we grappled back and forth with, and I don't know that sunset's the right word, there's probably a better word that we haven't thought of, but the notion of there's a duration, a 5-year duration, but then with an expedited process for Congress to consider should it be extended if the mission hasn't been accomplished. So I think, what we basically did, I feel like I learned from my being 0 for 2 on my first 2 efforts. Better be bipartisan. Better grapple with the different nature of war against non-states and against states and be drafted in somewhat of a different way to grapple with that intellectual complexity. And this is not just about authorization. As I was with the Marine generals this morning, they were talking about did a war game yesterday. And I said, don't tell me anything about the war game except this. Did your war game exercise, was it against a state adversary or non-state adversary? They said, it was about a state adversary. I said, tell me all the kinetic activity the Marines are involved in the world right now. Are you involved in kinetic activity right now against any state adversary? No, they're all non-state adversaries. We think about states, but the wars of the future, sadly, military actions of the future are probably more likely to be about non-states than states, and we have to reshape some of our thinking, big picture, budgetarily, how we wage war, but also how we deal with authorization questions. And it's been good to work with Jeff on this, and we're hopeful. Our chair, Senator Corker, has wanted to take this up when the time was right and there was a good product on the table, and he seems very focused on it now, and I think we can get there.
Well, as I mentioned to both of you, he was down here talking about how irresponsible Congress is, and that predates your efforts. Let me just applaud the fact that you're working on a bipartisan basis. It's so refreshing. And you're working on a goal that you want to achieve. It's not one of you blaming the other one for not achieving the goal.
Well, if we don't achieve it, I'll certainly try to find somebody to blame.
It'll be my fault.
My motivation.
How many in this audience think we need a new AUMF? How many don't? You don't be afraid. You won't get thrown out of the room. Okay, well, it's just interesting because I think the country is here. Let me ask a few questions and then we'll go to your questions. One of the tensions, at least that I've heard as I've talked endlessly to people in office, is a tension between the president as commander-in-chief wanting, not unlimited, but wanting, and not a blank check necessarily, but wanting adequate authority to exercise his or her authorities, and then Congress micromanaging. Do you think that with this draft, you have a balance that gives the commander-in-chief enough authority and just reserves to Congress the things that it should properly do?
I do believe so. I mean, the onus is on the president to come to Congress and say, all right, here's an associated force. Here's what they're doing in this specific country. But Congress is then required to act. If we don't, the president can move ahead. And it's a pretty high bar. We have expedited process, so something that's introduced within 10 days, it can move from the committee to the floor. There's, the motion to proceed is non-debatable, so nobody can filibuster it. But in the end, you'll have a cloture vote at the end, which will require 60 votes. And then the president can veto. So it's a 67 vote hurdle. So for those who think that we're taking too much authority from the president, Article 2, I would challenge that. The president does have to come forward, as it should be, and justify what he's doing. But it's a pretty high bar for the Congress to get over to stop the president from taking action.
I agree with what Jeff said about the process, and I'll say there are two kind of substantive issues that we really grappled with in the authorization. One that, both important to Democrats and Republicans, and one is this ground troop question. So in the first two versions of this authorization, we had some ground troop limitation. I had a pretty tight one in the first one I drafted because I just followed President Obama's speech on September 10th, and I put into the authorization just what he said. It was micromanaging. In the second version, we tried to figure out a way to square the circle between the Democratic and Republican versions, but I think you might still say it was sort of micromanaging. If the Article 1, Article 2 was supposed to be Congress declares, but boy, you don't want 535 commanders-in-chief. So once the declaration is done, you really should enable the president to have the ability to decide what tactics to use. And so the version that we have right now, and when we get into markup on this, I bet there will be amendments on this, and I'm sure there will be Democrats who don't like it. There's not a ground troop limitation. We have a geographic limitation. We have a tight definition of who the enemy is. We have a duration. There's no ground troop limitation because of this micromanagement issue. On the other hand, there will be some Republicans that won't like the 5-year, just like the Dems may not like the absence of a ground troop restriction. There's some Republicans that won't like a sunset. They will view a sunset as, why would you want to tell the enemy that you're out after 5 years? Well, I think we ought to be able to learn from experience. And the 2001 experience is if you don't put a duration, they just kind of live forever and they can get used for everything. So I would view the sunset as sort of it's a forcing mechanism to make sure we're back in reassessing and extending or not extending or adjusting and refining. And so we think that no micromanagement on tactics, but a duration is an acceptable way to kind of balance what should be executive prerogatives with what should be the congressional prerogative around authorization.
So I'm remembering the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, and if I remember correctly, which I may not, they were proposed by the White House.
Yes.
I also remember, and this wasn't mentioned, that Obama sent up an AUMF draft. I assume it was after his speech. I don't know when it was.
In February of 2015.
Which was DOA. It just never got attention. It became a partisan, like so much, sadly, has in recent years. It became just a partisan proposal. What role do you think, I mean, you're doing this as members of the Senate. Have you consulted this White House or the last White House? What role do you think a president, I'm not just asking about President Trump, should play in drafting and advocating for the AUMF that Congress
I think it always, Jeff said this earlier, and I agree. I think this always works better if the president makes a proposal and then the Congress puts the witnesses in the dock and asks them tons of tough questions, and then we apply a little sandpaper to it and change it. The 2001 authorization, in the aftermath of the attack on this nation, President Bush sent up a proposal that Congress didn't support.
Right.
The first Bush version did not get a yes vote. It was viewed as too broad. So even in the aftermath of that attack, Congress, and they voted on it 3 days later, but did some surgery on the language and changed it to impose some limits. But for the president to start and then for Congress to respond, that's probably ideal. Now, in this instance, we're not working with a proposal from the administration. However, we have had very strong testimony, both from the head of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, and Secretary Mattis, saying it's time for Congress to get in the game and do an AUMF. They have been very strong on that in testimony both before the House and the Senate. They're aware of our version. They've testified. We look forward to working with you on this. And I think part of our chair's idea is to get members from both the diplomatic and military side of the administration to come forward and offer us their pros and their cons, and here's how they would propose to make it better.
Right. I would put it this way. Our version is not inconsistent with any statements made by the administration. But you have to understand as well that any administration that is undertaking current activity in any country is going to be reluctant to propose an AUMF and come forward, because the failure of that seems to indicate that they realize that they may not have the legal basis to move forward with what they're doing. And so it's difficult for administration currently involved, Republican or Democrat, to come to Congress and say, all right, give us this because we need it. Because they have said we have the authority that we need. So I agree with Senator Kaine. It would be ideal for the administration to offer a language up and then for us to massage it. But I don't think that's realistic at this point.
But in your draft, you sunset, or you let the two existing AUMFs expire, so that you basically start afresh with something that applies to a more real world situation. Let me just ask you one more question based on a comment that Corker made here 4 years ago. He said, he said, very few Americans have any stake or ownership in our foreign policy. And I think that's a major problem. For those who may not fully understand how this works, what would the process to enact your AUMF do to include the public in a conversation about the wars we're engaged in or might be engaged in? What would give them a stake?
Well, I think by definition, the fact that Congress, the people's representatives, are engaged in this, and that we go through regular order. We've had one hearing, we'll have more. Go through a markup process, bring it to the floor, have amendments offered and accepted or rejected. That is the way the public gets involved. But certainly through the hearing process, and I've been hearing from my constituents, and it's been positive. People want to make sure, particularly those who have a connection to those serving in the military, they want to know that our adversaries and our allies and the troops know that we speak with one voice. And when Congress works with the administration on this, it's better. Our foreign policy is better when it's bipartisan, and when we can have vigorous debates as we consider legislation. But once it's there, we definitely need to speak with one voice on foreign policy.
Give you a real specific example. So on armed services and foreign relations, we've been asking the administration, what's the plan about Afghanistan? There was a news report, 2 weeks ago, that the president had sort of said, I'm going to let Secretary Mattis make the decision about number of troops in Afghanistan. Now, troops are not an end, they're a means to an end. What's the end? What's the strategy? There's no way we will have a discussion about this AUMF that authorizes military action against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Afghanistan. There's no way we'll have that discussion without having discussion, what's the strategy in Afghanistan? What is this administration's current posture? What do you think the troop strength number should be? And we'll have that in full view of the public. Rather than decisions that might just be handed to somebody to make, we'll have a discussion about Afghanistan. We're hearing all kinds of things, depending on whether you're talking to intel, state, or the military, you hear different levels of optimism or pessimism about what's going on in Afghanistan now, just to use that as an example. We'll get into that as we're having a discussion about this AUMF. We'll get into the discussion of Syria. When President Trump used missile strikes against Syria for using chemical weapons, we were briefed about 2 days later, and I asked General Dunford, now, what is our legal, both international and domestic, what is our legal justification for taking military action against the government of Syria? They weren't the perpetrators of the 9/11 attack, so it's not the 2001 authorization. It's not Iraq, it's not the 2002 authorization. What is the legal justification? We weren't invited into the country by the Syrian government, so it's not like mutual aid. We were invited by Iraq to come into Iraq to help them deal with ISIS. What's the legal justification? And we were told that is forthcoming. Well, it hasn't been forthcoming. But in a public hearing, we're going to air these questions, and the public will pay attention to them, I think, to some significant degree. I know in Virginia they will. And then when we have to put our name on the line, voting yes or no, that debate will hopefully, bring the public into this a little bit more, and then put an imprimatur on it so that the troops who are serving there believe that they've got the public's backing.
So,
I would just say to that point, Secretary Bob Gates, when he was at the Pentagon, was asked what he thought the greatest threat was, and people expected him to say, jihadists out there, the Iran and its nuclear threat. He said the following. He said, I think the biggest threat to our future sits here in Washington, D.C. and not someplace else. The rest of the problems of the world don't worry me if we had a functioning government. And if we had a Congress that could begin to address some of the long-term problems that this country has. I mean, the reality is our problems are deep enough in every category that none of them can be solved during the course of one presidency or one Congress. So you need bipartisan solutions that can be sustained through more than one presidency and more than one Congress. And we don't see any evidence of that in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
which is why the Wilson Center is here, and I hope why, perfect softball.
That was not the segue.
My friends from the Senate
good.
are here, and why this audience is here, because I think everybody here wants an outcome that is bipartisan and responsible. So on that point, my very last question is, I think you said it, Tim, about some members of Congress don't want to own the problem. They'd much rather blame the president, whoever that is, for doing something that doesn't achieve a good result, losing a war, having something happen. So, what do we say to those people? How do we overcome that, which is, I think, so unfortunate, and it exists in both political parties. How do we overcome the sort of blame game, the way too many people set it up so that it's not their fault?
This is a tough one. I mean, it does seem, I'm a newbie, so only here since 2013. So sadly, I was never here when the Senate was like really working. So I don't have anything to compare it to. Now, Jeff was here in the Congress, beginning a number of years ago, and Jane too. So they've seen it at different periods of functionality. I will say this, that the history of the Senate, though, is often a history of deep dysfunctionality, then functionality. It's not a one-way path to decline. I mean, you're having members of the Senate getting caned on the floor of the Senate during the debates in the 1850s, and then you also had the Senate doing the post-Civil War amendments that were really powerful. So it's a sine wave of dysfunction and function, and the dysfunction is not in the water supply, it's not sick building syndrome, it's just in the inclinations of people who walk in the building every day. So I think I am puzzled coming from a local government and state government perspective. In those iterations of my career, we would more often try to do things and then fight hard about who got the credit. And it does seem sometimes here is that we don't do things and then fight real hard about who to blame. Yeah. So I still am trying to wrap my head around that. But just in terms of the timing, there on this issue, Jane, there does seem to be, I mean, we're 16 years after the Declaration. You heard the stats that Jeff mentioned. 75% of the Senate, nearly 75% of the House weren't here, never voted on it. We got people deployed overseas, people who lost their lives in this battle against ISIS, and not a mumbling word out of us in terms of an authorization. So I think the magnitude of this abdication becomes more and more apparent to the public. You've got Trump administration official, General Dunford and Secretary Mattis saying, you ought to do this. Yeah. You've got, Barbara Lee, who's viewed in the House, obviously is one of the more left members of the House, proposes this amendment. She gets a unanimous vote out of House Armed Services. That shows there's an increasing sense of unease and disquiet about the status quo. We're standing on really shaky ground right now. And whether you believe we're actually doing things that aren't legal or, well, they're legal, but they really need to be cleaned up, there's a lot of disquiet. And if we can speak to that and work together with the administration, we can do something good. And we ought to try to do some good things to show people out, past the Beltway that Congress can still tackle hard issues and do good things.
Well, Barbara Lee was the only no vote
Yeah.
in 2001. That's why she has the moral authority to be doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Questions from the audience. Please identify yourselves and ask a question. There's a woman in the third row, second seat, right here.
Thank you all panelists, the senators, for a very elucidating discussion. It's one that I think is very, very much needed. my name is Elizabeth Dvorak-Little. I'm a stabilization specialist. I've spent the last 14 years in the Middle East and Afghanistan. So that frames my deep appreciation for bringing this to light. And both of the points that you made, Senator Flake, about the need for longitudinal policies and strategies, as well as what was echoed by yourself, Senator Kaine. This as someone that works on a strategic level on behalf of the U.S. government for the Afghan government, we're actually putting into place 5-year strategies for the Afghan government, and my own country doesn't have a current strategy against counterinsurgency and defense, as you aptly pointed out. This was my question to Susan Rice when she unfurled the February 2015 national security strategy with less than a year of activity left on the administration. Is this ever going to be implemented? And what's going to happen with the next administration? Because ISIS is a longitudinal threat. So with that in mind, why can't that be the horse before the cart? Mm-hmm. Firstly, I've heard very little out of this administration about addressing that. Why isn't that the first thing? And the second thing is what you're addressing in terms of congressional authorization.
So your question is, why doesn't the administration propose a strategy first and then have an AUMF that would complement and support that?
Mm-hmm. A defense strategy that would sub-strategy against terror.
Well, I think we're more likely to get that if Congress is vested in this process. Right now, when our imperative is to avoid the blame, then we don't insist on such a strategy or policy. If we get skin in the game, we authorize the administration to carry forward. It's tougher with Afghanistan. That'll be continuing a policy that we've had. But in particular with the others, in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we have 6-year terms in the Senate. The committee was always the committee that sees beyond the next hill. Mm-hmm. You outlasted administration. And I think we're getting back to that under the current leadership. And I hope that we do and require that kind of strategy. I just think it'll be more likely if we can get an AUMF passed and have members actually on the record voting for it.
I think that's a very fair critique. General Dunford was testifying once before Armed Services Committee, and he said to me, we have O plans but no strategy, operational plans but no strategy. We have a contingency plan for everything, but try to explain it as part of an overall strategy rather than just a laundry list of 1 million contingency plans. That's where we're sort of weak right now. I just wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs called The New Truman Doctrine, saying, could you imagine something like a Truman Doctrine circa 2017? Because we had a strategy, from 1947 until 1991. There was an overarching strategy, and things fit within it. The race to the moon, the Peace Corps, Fulbright scholarships, trade, military posture was part of a large strategy. Now, the world's very different, so it would be naive to think, okay, well, let's just do that now. You have to think about what it is. But even to say to the administration, come tell us what the Afghanistan strategy is, come tell us what the anti-ISIS strategy is. You can have 50 different strategies. What's the North Korea strategy? You can have 50 different strategies, but how do we conceive of American leadership in the world today when it's not a bipolar West Bloc, Soviet bloc? That hadn't been the case since 1991. So the old model of the way we viewed American leadership, we're still using concepts that are now defunct. What's the way we think about it now? So I do think that there, and Jeff and I wrote a piece, kind of I can't remember the title, but it was like, what would a bipartisan approach to a foreign policy strategy be, that we probably wrote about 18 months or 2 years ago, starting to identify some of the big questions that we ought to be grappling with. And the Wilson Center has a real role in this. This is for a White House. This is for Congress. But it's also for our think tanks and other organizations. They have to weigh in to help us think more broadly. Because we would love a strategy that could last past one administration, you know, or that could last even in a Congress that would switch party affiliation. The Truman Doctrine, Republican and Democratic presidents, Republican and Democratic Congresses, it was essentially intact. Not that it was perfect, it led us to make some bad decisions, but it was intact for 40 years.
Yeah. Well, you remind me that George Kennan, who was the author of the Long Telegram, was physically here, not in this building, but when we were in the old Smithsonian Castle for some years, and our Russia Institute is named after his family. We have some of his library. And there was somebody articulating a strategy, whether you like it or not, of containment, which lasted many, many years. And we don't seem to have those people, certainly not on a bipartisan basis in Congress, unless two of them, or the two of them, are sitting to either side of me. In the back, the man right there. Yeah.
Otto Kreischer with Sea Power Magazine. Senator Kaine, you talked about putting definition, who exactly we're fighting. Well, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they metamorphose all the time, spin-off groups, things like that.
Yeah.
And then we have other terrorist organizations, not directly a threat to the United States, but tearing up the world, like Boko Haram or things like that. How are you going to deal with all these spin-off groups that emerge and disappear?
Great, fantastic question. And I think we've done a really good job of it, but it might be able to be, this one might be able to even tightened up if we have this hearing. So what we've done in our bill is we've said Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban, we authorize action against them. Or associated forces. Unlike the 9/11 authorization, we define what an associated force is. An associated force, you sort of have to be three things. You have to be connected with ISIS, Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban. You have to be engaged in hostilities against the United States or its personnel. And you have to be listed by the president as such, and then that is not disapproved by Congress. So we try to tighten it up. So a good example would be Boko Haram. Boko Haram, about a year after ISIS started to run wild, they thought, man, these guys have got some juice. We're an affiliate of ISIS now, they said. Boko Haram pledged allegiance to ISIS. Would they be encompassed in our authorization? No, because they're not engaged in hostilities against the United States. They're claiming a connection to ISIS, but unless they're engaged in hostilities against the United States, they're not made part of our authorization. ISIS was a tough one. We're saying ISIS was part of the perpetrators of the 9/11 attack, justifying the connection to 2001. ISIS didn't form until 2003. So they didn't form until after 9/11, but they sort of came out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They came out of it, so they had some initial origins where they were tied. Well, in this case, some group that pops up later, you can't take action against them unless the president were to list them and say they are connected to one of the core three and they're engaged in hostilities against the United States. So we've certainly made it much tighter than is currently the case. But I'm not sure, we have to be humble about the fact that there could be some really good amendments that will be offered as we do this that will make our product stronger, and we're open to that.
Okay, someone in the front row, right here. Hold on, wait for the mic. Identify yourself. Ask a question. A really good question.
That I will do. My name is Sam. I'm a student at Columbia University. I also want to say I saw the Senate Foreign Relations hearing a couple weeks ago, and I was really inspired by the bipartisanship displayed at that hearing. My question is, if the president currently has been taking military action on the thin strings of the 2001-2002 authorization, even if we narrow the scope of a new authorization, what will prevent the administration from simply taking military action in a way that is beyond the scope of this authorization but can be justified under the previous authorizations?
Well, if we pass this authorization, we will nullify and repeal the 2001 and 2002. So I think to try to justify action based on those wouldn't be possible anymore. But we do authorize specific action. Those are the big three that we do name in this authorization. So activity with regard to them, that would be up to the president in terms of his strategy or his tactics moving forward.
I will say the one thing we can't resolve is the ambiguity between Article 1 and Article 2. So this would be a resolution, but it's not going to trump the Constitution. And the Constitution does have an ambiguity that the framers were very well aware of. So Article 1, Congress declares war. Article 2, the President's the Commander-in-Chief. Article 1 also has the power of the Congress to be the appropriator, so we fund operations. That was recognized by the framers as, you know, we're defining the roles pretty clearly, but there's a little bit of an ambiguity, because what does it mean to be Commander-in-Chief? And they understood, so Congress declares war, but you know, when Congress is in recess, everybody's riding horseback back to Vermont. So what if something happens all of a sudden? We can't wait till everybody's back in D.C. for Congress to take action. So the idea from the very beginning was the Commander-in-Chief power was not just a power to implement a war authorization, it was also a power to defend the United States against an imminent threat. Imminent threat. Now that's a subjective term. You know, how imminent does it have to be? And you would tend to want to give the executive some benefit of the doubt on that. So that's why President Obama decided in August of 2014, wow, ISIS is running wild. Now they're threatening a U.S. consulate in Erbil. Under any interpretation, even without a war authorization, Article 1, Article 2, the President's Commander-in-Chief can use military action to protect a U.S. consulate. So the President acted, and within about 2 or 3 weeks, the U.S. consulate and our operations in the Kurdish part of Iraq were safe. And then the President said, now it's time to go on offense against ISIS. That has been sort of the traditional dividing line. President Jefferson faced the same thing with the Barbary Coast pirates. If they're attacking our Navy, I can order that we repel the attack. But after the 50th one, I'm getting tired of repelling attacks. We ought to go on offense against them. But Jefferson said, well, if it's going on offense to destroy their ships so they can't attack us, that's when I need Congress. But our resolution can't change, you know, it doesn't trump the Article 1, Article 2, and both the clear descriptions, but also there is a little bit of gray area there that the framers understood and that we're going to have to live with. What we do, though, just gives much more shape to the current status quo, but it doesn't resolve all the ambiguities.
But just as you were saying that, Tim, I was thinking about how the George W. Bush administration, term 1, handled this. A lot of what they did in response to 9/11 was through the President's Commander-in-Chief authorities. And some might say that was right, and some might say that was wrong. But a problem from the perspective of people in Congress was they didn't go through Congress. So 1, Congress couldn't really exercise effective oversight, but 2, the public wasn't totally engaged through the regular order of Congress. So I mean, it's a hard problem, but I would assume you would both agree with me that to the extent that Congress is cut out, our nation is deprived of an important Article 1 mechanism to have a public square.
And Jeff often points this out. The nation is deprived without the public involvement, understanding what the stakes, but also what's the message that you send to allies? Oh, Congress is unwilling to have a vote and bless this. What's the message you send to adversaries? Congress is afraid to have it. What's the message you send to your troops? There is a message that is sent from a congressional debate and vote in full view of the public that is not just an internal message, it's also an external message to allies and adversaries that's important to send.
Okay, yeah. Right here.
Michael Waller, I'm a member of the Wilson Center Council. I want to go back to a comment you made, Senator Kane, about the absence of backbone. I assume
As
that
I
the
slouch
absence
in my
of,
chair up here.
I assume that the absence of backbone in some way relates to public sentiment in your constituencies, some way or another. And we've heard commentary here that this war on terror is starting to look a little bit like the war on drugs or the war on poverty, et cetera. So I'm wondering whether there is some investment by your constituents in the status quo that is driving this absence of backbone, number 1. And number 2, related to that, in an action against a non-state actor, there's not going to be a Bay of Tokyo or a Treaty of Paris event. Does Congress want a say in saying that it's over?
Good questions. That's why we have the smartest people.
I'll take the first
belonging
question.
to
You
our
take that
council.
second one.
Yeah.
With regard to our what's going to force us to have backbone, I mentioned that I do hear from constituents who applaud our step forward here. Having said that, this is not an overwhelming issue. I mean, it's health care, it's tax policy, it's regulation, it's a lot of other things come before this. And so members of Congress are not feeling the heat, maybe in certain constituencies with big military populations or other issues that they have, but not across the country. So, I mean, the lack of backbone is simply a function of you're not hearing it from your constituents, and you can afford to just let it go. I don't think we should. I think as responsible legislators, we ought to move forward with it. But that's the reality right now. You want to take the...
Yeah, the second one, I mean, John McCain has been helpful on these issues. McCain, he's the chair of Armed Services, obviously really thinks we ought to do this. And he and I once were on the floor talking about this, and he said, the non-state issue, you're not going to have the signing of a treaty on the deck of a carrier in the Bay of Tokyo. You're not going to have that. So the intellectual challenge of war against non-states is a peculiar one. They don't follow Geneva Conventions, so do we follow the rules when our opponent isn't? The geography isn't so clear, so there's all kinds of issues, and that's one of them. What is success when almost by definition you're not going to have a surrender document, right? But that's why I think that's why the duration issue is important. We should always, going in, be asking our military leaders, and what does success look like? Okay, so we're going to do this. What do you think success looks like? I think the nation missed an opportunity after the death of bin Laden to say, we got the main perpetrator. Now we're still here battling Al-Qaeda, but it's 10 years after the authorization. We didn't step back and really have okay, bin Laden is dead and much of the senior leadership is dead. What is the continuing mission here? We missed an opportunity by not having that. Right. And if we had some kind of a sunset or something, we might have really had that discussion. So it's a really good point about how it ends. We ought to be always challenging our leadership. What's the mission? What's our progress toward the mission? But I think this duration thing gives us the ability to deal with situations where there isn't going to be a surrender document.
Let me just add one thing you didn't mention, but probably certainly aware of or thinking about, as we have, but haven't solved it, is the detention issue.
Yeah.
An indefinite detention, and how does that play in? And what, basically, as I think we see it, if the president has explicit authority and a firm authorization, then he is authorized to take all appropriate action, which would include, the Supreme Court has said, detention. But still, it gets dicey because the detention often lasts longer than the conflict.
Well, Guantanamo Bay as a prison was not set up by Congress. It was set up under the president's commander-in-chief authorities to be outside the reach of U.S. law. I remember this. I lived this. And then the Supreme Court decided that that was not possible and that these people deserved counsel. And now we are in this conundrum about what do we do with the high-value targets where the evidence was obtained in ways that wouldn't pass muster in U.S. courts. So it's a hard problem maybe that would have been avoided if Congress on the front end had considered what do we do with the people we detain on the battlefield or off the battlefield during this war on non-state and state actors after 9/11, or mostly non-states. In the back, I saw a woman's hand. I can't really see you, but I think I can. Way over there. Yes, you're 3 in from, yeah, right there.
Thank you very much. My name is Jennifer Glodemans. I work at the State Department, and my question goes to the Article 1, Article 2 gray area and dilemma, and some would say that the War Powers Act tries to address some of that, and I was wondering if you see any linkage between your bill and your proposal and the War Powers Act. Would the authorization invalidate the need for that to ever come into power, or just curious how you're thinking about that?
So can I?
Yeah.
So let me tell you how I understand the War Powers Act, which I also think needs to be rewritten, and Senator McCain and I have a proposed rewrite of it. Of course, the War Powers Act can't change the Constitution, so the powers are still as they are, Article 1, Article 2. So the War Powers Act basically set up a process whereby a president could initiate military activity, and then unless Congress sort of ratifies it within 60 days, the president has to stop at day 90. That's what it says. There's some other stuff too. Well, I don't think that gives the president the Article 1 power to declare war. I think that War Powers Act is really about the situation where the president takes unilateral action under the commander-in-chief power to defend the nation from imminent threat. And in taking that action, the president can go forward, but there's an expectation that Congress will then ratify that action. But it doesn't transfer Article 1 powers to the president. So I view this as really more of a kind of a timing statute to condition how the president uses the Article 2 powers when he's engaged in unilateral activity to defend the nation. Now the problem with the War Powers Act is it's never really been followed. Presidents give the authorization. I'm doing this pursuant to the War Powers Act, but I'm not going to follow the 60 or 90 day thing. And no president has, Democratic or Republican. They don't follow the 60 or 90 day thing at all. It's been completely unworkable. And there's some pretty good argument that some pieces of it, even as drafted, were unconstitutional because there's some provisions of the War Powers Act that allow Congress to take steps that are not subject to a presidential veto. So it violates something called the presentment clause. You take an action, you present it to the president vetoes it, you override it. So there were some challenges with it from the beginning. Senator McCain and I used something that the Miller Center at the University of Virginia did. They put a War Powers Commission together in 2006 and 2007, and they came up with a proposed rewrite of the War Powers Act to solve some of the constitutional problems. And Senator McCain and I have introduced this on one occasion to try to get some interest in it. And I kind of view that as the longer term issue. Working with Senator Flake on the current military actions that we're involved in and try to rationalize them. But I also think we just need a better consultative process between the executive and the legislature on this question. A good process doesn't make a war decision easy, far from it. But a bad process or no process or a shifting process can make this very hard issue even harder. And we don't really have a good process. And rewriting the War Powers Act, I think, would be a way to make the process a little bit better.
We have time, I guess, for one last question, and we'll go over here.
My name is Tom Dine, and I'm hearing it all again. I worked in the Senate starting in 1970 for Senator Frank Church, and that's where I met Jane when she worked for Senator Tunney.
I was 5 years old.
And you still are, dear. This has been great, and it reminds me of a lot of old stuff, because the Senate of 1970 and then beyond was anti-Vietnam and wanted to overcome the hibernation of the Senate that had taken place for such a long time in its role in foreign defense policy. One of so today there was, both of you, and you've both been terrific on this subject, have used words like the public is not invested, inclinations of the people. Well, back then, there was a draft. Mm-hmm. There's no draft today. Mm-hmm. You don't really have the will of the people, therefore, involved in whether or not we go to war, or whether or not we strike and leave, etc. And by the way, on the duration clause, Senator Mathias and Senator Church put together a bill in the early 70s to end the state of national emergency. We had been in a state of national emergency since March of 1933. And there had been several declared and never ended. So we had 5 states of emergency at that particular point. And President Ford, being a legislator basically, understood, okay, Mac's making a big deal here, so he went along with it and signed the bill. So you can only declare a state of emergency for a limited period of time. Mm-hmm. And so I think that duration situation is critical. So my question is, can we have an inspired public without the public involved in national security, except for a professional army, which is highly professional and extremely good?
It's certainly more difficult. Some of us with a connection to it, with my brother, for example, he's on, I think, his 13th deployment.
Ooh.
Right now in Afghanistan. He's in the Air Force Reserves. So some of us feel that and see that, but a lot of the country does not. And a lot of the people's representatives in Congress do not. So it is more difficult. And I think that that's why we simply have to lead. And even if it's not, we're not being pushed by our constituents, I think it's our responsibility, constitutional responsibility, to make this right and to recognize that that we're more effective, and if we want to succeed internationally with these conflicts, we need to speak with one voice. So I think it's just incumbent on us to act.
That's such a good point. I went and judged a debate over at GW, maybe my first or second year as in the Senate. And a young woman stood up, and she's probably about 20. I can't remember where she was in college. And she said, "All I know is war, and I don't know anything about war." So my entire childhood has been shaped by war, but I do not know anything about war because I have no connection to it. And I thought that was a really fascinating dichotomy. And to make it even more complicated, we don't have a draft. Up through Vietnam, we at least would tax ourselves for war. As unpopular as Vietnam was, Congress did pass, it was partially deficit financed, but there was a tax for the war. So we don't have a draft. We put it all on the credit card. Congress doesn't have to vote on it. And we can ask Blackwater or somebody else to do a whole lot of it and use a contractor, not even use the military. And all of those things are essentially a compounding outsourcing of the moral gravity of the decision, of a decision that is supposed to have a moral gravity to it. So that does make kind of bringing it to the fore and getting people invested in it harder, but no less important.
So on that note, Tom, history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it rhymes, to quote Mark Twain. We were there. These issues continue. I want to thank both Tim and Jeff for their service. Remember, Congress is a combat zone. But more important than your service is the service of your families and the service of America's family to the extent it serves. And to say, we have to resolve this. It is important for people to take responsibility. It's also important, in my view, to consider this idea of national service, which Stan McChrystal and others are proposing, so that you can serve in many ways, so that every American has skin in the game. At any rate, this is what I love doing at the Wilson Center. It's bipartisan, it's serious, and the audience is fantastic. Thanks to our panelists, thanks to you.
Thanks, Dean.